Imagine waking up before sunrise. Not in a warm bedroom, not under a thick blanket from a store, not with a heater humming in the corner. Just on frozen ground, in a world where the cold is already winning. Outside, the wind is moving like a knife. The plants are gone, or buried, or dead. The river might be covered in ice. The animals might have moved. And the sky is still dark. Now here is the terrifying part. Your body is basically a tiny campfire. It is always trying to make heat, but winter is always trying to steal it. Cold air steals it. Wind steals it faster. Wet clothing steals it even faster. Frozen ground pulls it out through your feet and legs, and once your body loses too much heat, strength disappears. Your hands stop working. Your thinking gets slow. Even simple choices become dangerous. So how did ancient humans survive winter? The easy answer is fire, and fire was huge. Fire gave heat. Fire gave light. Fire made food easier to chew and safer to eat. Fire pushed predators and darkness away. Fire gave people a center, a place to sit, a place to work, a place to talk, a place where the night felt a little less powerful. But fire alone was not the answer. That is the first mistake we make when we picture ancient winter. We imagine a cave, a fire, and everyone is fine. But winter was not one problem. Winter was a whole chain of problems. You had to stay warm. You had to stay dry. You had to breathe. You had to find food. You had to protect children. You had to repair tools. You had to know where animals went. You had to survive today without ruining tomorrow. So the real answer is this. Ancient humans did not survive winter with one miracle invention. They survived by stacking small solutions into a system. Fire was part of the system. Clothing was part of the system. Food timing was part of the system. Shelter was part of the system. Tools, memory, and cooperation held the whole thing together. And once you see winter this way, the story gets much more interesting. Because even fire had a problem. Smoke. Picture a cave on a freezing night. Outside, the wind is brutal. Inside, stone walls block the weather. So you build a fire. At first, it feels like survival. Then the smoke rises. It spreads under the ceiling. It drifts into the place where people are sitting. It burns eyes. It catches in throats. It makes children cough. Suddenly, the thing saving you is also making the shelter hard to live in. So the real question is not just, did ancient humans have fire? The better question is, did they know how to live with fire? At Lazaret Cave in France, researchers studied this problem. They looked at where ancient people placed a hearth. Then they modeled how smoke would move through the cave. They tested different possible places for the fire. And here is the wait what part. The actual hearth was not just anywhere. It was in a zone that gave people access to warmth and usable space while reducing smoke exposure. In other words, the cave was not just a hole with a fire in it. It was organized. There was a fire zone, a smoke zone, a work zone, a place where people could actually spend time. That means winter survival started with something invisible, airflow. Ancient people had to learn how smoke behaved, where warm air went, where cold air entered, where people could sit close enough to feel heat, but not so close that smoke filled their faces. That kind of knowledge does not look impressive in a museum case. It is not a shiny weapon. It is not a giant monument. But in winter, it could decide whether a cave was livable. And even if the hearth was perfect, it still had one big limit. Someone eventually had to leave it. Someone had to gather wood. Someone had to check the landscape. Someone had to follow tracks. Someone had to carry water. Someone had to hunt. The fire could make a warm circle, but life could not stay inside that circle forever. This is where clothing becomes one of the most important survival technologies humans ever made. Today, clothing feels ordinary. A coat is just a coat. A hat is just a hat. But in a frozen world, clothing is not just fabric or fur. Clothing is a shelter you wear. A loose animal hide helps. It blocks some wind. It gives some insulation. But fitted clothing changes everything. A close layer traps warm air near the skin. Another layer blocks wind. A hood protects the head. Foot wraps protect skin from frozen ground. Sleeves keep the arms warm while the hands stay free. That last part matters, because if your hands are trapped holding a blanket around your body, you cannot carry tools. You cannot repair a spear point, you cannot scrape a hide, you cannot help move food. But if warmth is built around your body, you can work. You can move. You can survive away from the fire. The strange thing is that most ancient clothing vanished. Fur rots, leather breaks down, plant fibers disappear, thread decays. A coat can save someone's life and then leave almost nothing behind. So archaeologists look for clues around the missing object. They look for scrapers used to prepare hides. They look for bone awls that could punch holes. They look for needles that could sew tighter seams. And in one of the weirdest clues, they look at lice. Clothing lice live in clothing. They need clothing. So when scientists studied the genetic split between head lice and clothing lice, they used it as a clue for when humans may have been wearing clothing regularly. That estimate points back around 170,000 years. Think about that. One of the clues to ancient winter survival is a parasite. A tiny bug helps reveal a giant human invention. Later, sewing tools like eyed needles tell another part of the story. They suggest people could make more refined clothing. Not just skins thrown over shoulders, clothing that could fit better. Close gaps, hold layers, maybe even carry identity and decoration. But for winter survival, the basic idea is simple. Clothing slowed heat loss, and slowing heat loss bought time. Time to walk, time to hunt, time to gather, time to make one more decision before the cold took over. But now we hit the next problem. Moving only helps if you know where food will be. Because in winter, hunger is not just hunger. Hunger is cold. When you do not have enough energy, your body has less fuel to keep itself warm. And the colder it gets, the more expensive every movement becomes. Walking through snow costs energy. Carrying wood costs energy. Shivering costs energy. Even staying alive costs energy. So food was not just about filling the stomach. Food was heat stored in another form. This is where winter becomes a calendar. The smartest time to solve a winter food problem is often before winter. At a site called Lubna 6, in what is now Czechia, researchers studied reindeer remains from the Ice Age. They looked at chemical clues in teeth and evidence that could help show when the animals died and how they moved through the landscape. The story that appears is not random hunting. It looks strategic. Reindeer mattered because they were not just meat. They were a bundle of survival materials moving through the landscape. Meat could feed the group, fat could fuel bodies. Hide could become clothing, bedding, or shelter cover. Bone could become tools. Antler could become points, handles, or other useful pieces. Sinew could help bind things together. So one animal was not one resource. It was many resources stacked together. And timing mattered. If hunters knew when reindeer were nearby, they could meet winter before winter became desperate. They could hunt when the animals were accessible. They could gather useful parts before deep cold made everything harder. This is a huge shift in how we should imagine ancient survival. It was not just people wandering through snow, hoping to find dinner. It was people remembering patterns. Where the animals moved, when they appeared, which valleys mattered, which routes were worth following, which season gave the best return for the risk. Winter survival began in autumn. That is the twist. By the time snow was deep and days were short, some of the most important decisions had already been made. Had the group gathered enough food? Had they prepared enough hides? Had they repaired enough tools? Had they chosen the right place to wait out the worst part? Because every missed chance in autumn could become a crisis in winter. And every smart choice in autumn could become warmth later. A hide becomes a coat. A bone becomes a tool. Fat becomes body heat. A memory becomes a root. A root becomes food. Food becomes another week alive. But even food and clothing were not enough without shelter. A human body wrapped in fur is still small compared to a winter landscape. Wind can steal heat from every side. Snow can cover tools. Wet ground can ruin rest. And rest matters. If nobody sleeps well, nobody hunts well. If tools cannot be repaired, hunting gets worse. If skins cannot be processed, clothing gets worse. If children cannot be kept close, the whole group is at risk. So shelter was not just a place to hide. Shelter was a workspace, a repair space, a food space, a care space, a memory space. Sometimes the shelter was a cave, sometimes it was a rock overhang. Sometimes it was built from wood, branches, hides, brush, snow, or earth. And sometimes, in landscapes where trees were limited, people used something much stranger: mammoth bones. At Mezhyrish in Ukraine, archaeologists found large structures made partly from mammoth bones and tusks. This is one of those discoveries that sounds almost unreal, but it makes sense when you think like a survivor. If the land does not give you lumber, but it does give you the remains of enormous animals, you use what is there. Heavy bones can anchor things. Tusks can help form structure. Hides, bark, or wood can cover gaps. The point was not to build a beautiful house. The point was to make a pocket of control. A place where wind was weaker, a place where tools could be fixed, a place where skins could be worked, a place where food could be shared, a place where people could gather close enough for knowledge to move between them. That phrase matters. Knowledge had to move. Because none of this worked if each person started from zero. Nobody survives a serious winter by guessing everything for the first time. Someone had to know where the smoke went. Someone had to know which hide was ready. Someone had to know how to sew a seam that would not split. Someone had to know when the reindeer usually passed through. Someone had to know which bones were useful. Someone had to know where the wind was less cruel. Someone had to know which child was getting too cold. Someone had to know when to move and when to stay. That is why ancient winter survival was social. A lone person has one pair of hands. A group has many. One person gathers fuel. One person watches children. One person repairs a tool. One person scrapes hide. One person remembers a route. One person notices a change in weather. One person shares food. One person teaches. The fire matters, but the circle around the fire matters too. Because that circle is where the system comes together. Fire without shelter is fragile. Shelter without food is temporary. Food without tools is luck. Tools without clothing are hard to use in deep cold. Clothing without knowledge fails. Knowledge without a group can disappear. So the real survival tool was not one thing. It was the connection between things. A hearth placed in the right part of a cave, a hide turned into clothing, a hunt timed to the season, a bone turned into a tool, a shelter built from whatever the land allowed, a memory carried from one winter to the next. That is the part that feels almost modern. We survive winter with systems too. Heating systems, food systems, weather systems, road systems, supply chains. Insulated houses, warm clothes made by people we will never meet. Ancient humans had systems too. They were smaller, they were rougher, they were carried in hands and habits instead of written manuals. But they were still systems, and every winter tested them. Did the group prepare early enough? Did they remember the right places? Did they make clothing strong enough? Did they keep the fire useful without choking the shelter? Did they share enough to keep the group alive? Did they teach the next generation before the knowledge was lost? That may be the most important part of the whole story. When a child survived winter, they did not just survive cold. They survived inside a web of knowledge. They watched where the fire was placed. They saw how smoke moved. They felt how clothing trapped warmth. They learned which animal parts mattered. They heard where the herds came through. They slept inside shelters built from stone, hide, wood, bone, and memory. And later, when that child grew older, they became part of the system too. Maybe they were the one who remembered the valley. Maybe they were the one who fixed the seam. Maybe they were the one who noticed the wind changing. Maybe they were the one who told a younger child, stay closer to the fire, but not where the smoke goes. That is how winter was beaten. Not once, not forever, but again and again. One fire, one coat, one hunt, one shelter, one remembered lesson at a time. Ancient humans were not stronger than winter. They were better at preparing together.